right, we are back for another episode of Beyond Barriers. Beyond Barriers is a conversation with leaders and community evangelists about the challenges of navigating an effective accessibility strategy. Guests during these episodes get to share their journeys of successes and setbacks with a primary focus of how they've overcome these specific obstacles that could have otherwise ended their journey in accessibility. My name is Brian Gavin. I'm the co-founder of Wally, and I'm today's host. I'm delighted to be joined by Cameron MacDonald. Cameron, thank you so much for joining today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Well, we have a jam-packed conversation. I always like to kind of break the ice, start by hearing a little bit about you, how you got into accessibility, and the leader that you are there today.
For sure. So yeah, I actually started out completely as a full-on programmer. My background's in computer science. And when I got out of school, I started my first job and was very set on doing that software development path. But as things happen, I ended up being exposed to user experience. And user experience was a field that I was not super familiar with because you don't really hear about it a ton in school, especially if you're in the computer science program. And so once I learned about that, I was very interested, and I was saying, oh, this might be more up my alley, because I've always had kind of a creative interest, but and kind of more of like a psychology interest as well. But I didn't feel confident going into those fields, mainly because, quite honestly, computer science and programming is a really good field for getting jobs. There's a lot of jobs out there. So
Sure.
I decided to start exploring that field more while I was at my job there, and I started doing more UX design work as well as more front end development, and kind of continued down that path. Went back to full stack development for a bit, and then finally kind of started digging into accessibility properly afterwards, and started working in that in the design system space. And that is where it became a much bigger factor, because design systems are about setting the standard for the rest of the teams that are utilizing it, and so you need to be consistent with your offerings, especially in the accessibility realm. And so once I had done that, I decided to start pursuing more specific knowledge and kind of try to put my money where my mouth was, and I ended up getting certified in it's the Certified Professional in Accessibility Core Competencies. I think I got that right, from IAAP. It's called the CPACC usually. But so I ended up going and getting that certification to kind of just at least show, like, hey, I've learned all these things, and yeah, it's real. I passed an exam. Look at me. I have a piece of paper that says I know things. So
And so you put it to practice as well. Let me step back for 1 second. I'm curious, when you went through your education, was accessibility something in your studies that came up from a development or computer science perspective?
absolutely not. It was not mentioned in the slightest. I mean, I will say, to give them a little bit of leniency, the
Yeah.
program I was in was pretty academic focused. It was
Yeah.
very like theory heavy, but as far as I'm aware, there's not really any talk of accessibility, even in the application programming courses, because it's just not something that really comes up in the tech world in general. I mean, I don't think I had even heard of it in any developer spaces outside of my school. The reason I learned about it was because I started going into the UX space, and that's where people are more in the design thinking realm and more user and person focused, whereas, like, not to poo poo engineering or anything, but it is a much more logical problem solving space, and as a result it gets missed a lot. And I think part of that dichotomy as well is we're in this weird kind of in between world when you're in front end development, where companies seem to kind of want people who are like very engineering heavy and can still write these super complex front end applications with all the extra frameworks and doing database work and all that, but also want you to be design thinking and accessibility oriented. So it's really kind of a jack of all trades, and there's a lot expected out of front end developers nowadays. So that's a long-winded way to say, when I was in school, no, it did not come up. It was very much something that I learned about after the fact.
when you were sharing about the database work, the complexity that applications have grown to, my head was like, all right, like, um, and so your exposure to design systems, was the design system that you were first exposed to built with accessibility in mind? Were you building it from the ground up? Walk me through a little bit of that exposure that was the catalyst for you.
Yeah, I mean, so the first one I was ever like exposed to in any shape or form was just Google's material, and so that was a really great place to learn because Google is Google, and one of the things they do really well is they have really, really good, clean, clear documentation, and so I started going through theirs, and kind of the biggest thing I was learning from it was a lot of their philosophy and the thinking that went on behind the scenes of why these decisions are made, which I think is just as important as the actual decisions themselves. And I think sometimes it gets overlooked. Like I've seen plenty of organizations where they just go, oh, just borrow the things from material. It's like, okay, but while material is an awesome example, not everything they do necessarily applies to your use case. And you have to kind of take those things into consideration because what you're doing is not necessarily what Google's doing. And so you might have to change some of these offerings and some of these ideas depending on what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And so material is kind of the big one. And then I kind of started learning more about those and carbon. And I've recently been really obsessed with the Cedar design system from REI. I really like their documentation. But that is to say, so once I started working on design systems of my own, it was something where I was working on design systems that had been around for a while and were built kind of before these accessibility movements were quite as big and quite as well understood. And so it was something where it was a new challenge for us to approach, where we had to start being more, what's the word I'm looking for, more intentional with it. You know, it's not to say that things are necessarily all inaccessible, but it's more that, are we thinking about it, or do we need to be actively thinking about it more? And it's been a really good learning experience, especially just reading other design systems and seeing what they do well, but also maybe what they don't do well. You know, no one's perfect. And sometimes you find an example and you're like, oh, they missed that piece. And am I missing that piece? I should go look at my system now and see if what they're doing and making the mistake is a mistake I'm making. And is it a common mistake? Is it something that we should all be keeping an eye out for? So it is great to have that ability to go out and do that. And I really appreciate it when companies keep their design systems and their design artifacts and everything open source, where people can go and look at them and learn from them, because it's been really fundamental in my journey.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, what was the biggest takeaway from material around the why decisions are made?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is just to look at your users, like talk to them. The one of my biggest takeaways was just that they do look at it from a very human perspective, and it sounds so like obvious when you say it out loud, like, yeah, you should look at it from a human purpose. But this is something that has I feel frustrated me with the UX field as of late. Is I do feel like we're running into this weird kind of like what's the word, like this juncture where UX is like half people who are like designers and are doing kind of the artsy thing, and it's half like business people who are really focused on the marketing aspect of it, and then like in the middle there's kind of like this mix of that, and some people who are really interested in the psychology aspect. But I do think the user experience part has become such a business focused field nowadays, and marketing focused specifically, that sometimes it gets a little lost in the details, and people forget about kind of like the end user, and they're more focused on, you know, uh, engagement and like getting people to click and things like that, rather than trying to focus on what is this person trying to accomplish? How can we help them accomplish that?
Mm.
I do feel like that's something that in general, like that just falls into universal design. If you make something that is intuitive and that people will enjoy using, that will help your product. And that is something that I think sometimes people forget, and they kind of worry about being on the next hottest thing and being, you know, on top of the latest technology or what have you. And I mean, the secret behind every successful thing out there and every successful product or experience that you enjoy is thoughtfulness. It's people who actually take the time to understand how people tick and make something that makes sense to their users and is pleasant and enjoyable. And if you do that, I think everything else comes with it.
Yeah, and the flashy object or shiny object approach, especially when you're dealing on design systems that have been around for a minute, you sometimes probably are accumulating more technical debt than you would have otherwise. So that's yeah.
Absolutely.
So the purpose driven and the inspiration from REI and some of these other open source design systems.
Mhm.
Can you share within those the inspiration and the joys, or even any of the challenges you've come across?
Yeah. So, I mean, the biggest thing that I've taken, especially from some of the documentation from like REI and everything, is that they really do try to approach it from the aspect of what is our user doing, what is the most logical way for them to interact with or interface with our product. How do they want to see these things presented to them? What is the best way to present this information such that it will be easy for them to understand? And also along those lines, of course, the accessibility considerations. If we're presenting it this way and we want to make it all fancy, what is that fallback or what is that alternative approach? So that if someone cannot interact with it in the really high-end interface way that, maybe it's too much motion or it has these extra little interactive effects that don't really convey a lot of context, how do we provide that extra context so that someone who is using an assistive technology can actually glean the information they need from it? And one thing that they did recently that I was really, really interested in was they shipped a flexible typographic scale. And so the thing that they're doing now is they're setting it up to be more responsive with every viewport. So now they actually, depending on the container size that it's in, it will scale the text ever so slightly to kind of adjust for when these containers change sizes. And I think that's just a really great contextual thing where it allows that information to stay at the right level of size and real estate, so that you're not running into these things where one thing kind of dominates over the rest, because that can also be challenging, just for the average user, but especially with folks who have cognitive disabilities and they're trying to focus on one specific task and things are either jumping around or you switch it to a phone and suddenly the text is like way too big on the screen and you have to scroll to keep track of everything. These are these little thoughts where like you implement them, and once you see it, you're like, oh my God, this was a no-brainer. But it's something that, especially when you're deep in the weeds, people forget. I mean, I forget these things all the time. I'm not going to say that I'm perfect. I have things to do and I have deadlines and I have things I have to ship. So you can't just make everything the perfect, blue sky solution that you want it to be. But it is important to stop and think about those things and actually take some time to kind of consider maybe some aspects that aren't necessarily a daily problem, but are a larger problem that you could address. And often the solution isn't even that difficult, technically speaking. It's usually just more of like you have to put some thought into it first.
Sure. And so you said know your user, right?
Yeah.
You're dealing with millions of users on a platform, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you know your user when you have when you have millions of users?
Yeah.
Or
I
billions
mean,
in some of these apps cases, right?
yeah, of course. And I mean, that's a fair question. Of course, you have a diverse user base, but I think ultimately the biggest thing to remember is that your user is a human being. And I think speaking to even a subset of your users is better than not speaking to any users. And the more you speak to, the better. And trying to get people from different backgrounds, like even if it's just one person from each background, now you have a bit of a slice of each little aspect of somebody who's a different person that uses your product and what they do and the context they bring with them when they come to interact with this. Because it's important to understand someone's mental model, and people have different mental models based on things they've interacted with in the past. They have different mental models based on their own experiences with similar products in the past. And so you need to have these understandings when you're designing for these people, because that's how you ensure that they understand what you're trying to communicate to them and they understand how to accomplish these goals. And one thing that I had learned about that I thought was really interesting, and again had never occurred to me until I finally learned it, was when you're specifically interviewing users with disabilities. So if you're interviewing someone who, may have a motor disability, vision, what have you, something that may require them to use an assistive technology or may otherwise change their experience.
Right.
One person I had gone to a talk to had pointed out that you should actually separately test folks who have a disability from birth versus people who have an acquired disability. And the reason being that they have completely different ways of how they approach working within the bounds of that disability, depending on whether they've just essentially never known any different or had a completely different mental model that they had to change because later in life they acquired this disability and now it's forced them to rethink how they interact with interfaces and with products. And so that, I think, is a huge way to get to know your user, is to break it down and say, okay, well, we have this person who, was in a car accident later in life and now doesn't have as great a motor skills, or this person who was born with this a disability that lowers their vision. It's important to consider those contexts because they might intuitively know how to use a screen reader and those technologies because they grew up with them. But if someone
Sure.
had recently become blind, they might not know as well how to interact with those things. And how do you make sure that you're not just assuming that someone who's using your application with a screen reader is adept with the screen reader? And can you make it easier for people to understand and navigate these things? And can you simplify the information architecture so that they are able to get to what they need quickly without having to go through a bunch of extra hoops?
So I have one more question on this know your user topic.
Yeah.
Are you coming up with the user personas, or are there team members that you're collaborating with, like data, marketing, data science, or where are these individual human beings, right? Where are they coming from? How are you identifying them?
Yeah, I would say in my experience, it's usually been that I'm working with people who are doing this. It's usually a user research team.
Yep.
And that has been, I think, the best way. I think the best way to do these is to have a dedicated research team. I really think that if a company is going to be doing this seriously and really taking user experience seriously, which everyone should, they should definitely have a dedicated research team, because it is a lot of work. It's a lot of time consuming work. And having them have the time and the space and the energy and the funding to go and say, okay, we're going to literally just going to start looking at our user bases and reaching out to people and potentially going out and interviewing people physically somewhere. It allows them to collect the most detailed data you can get and to give you the most holistic picture of what your user is and what your user base is. And it lets them kind of form, not only those personas, but a few personas based on kind of a general demographic. For example, a product I worked on in the past was the general demographic of people interacting with that was typically older people. And so that was something you had to take into consideration, because the average person was not only older, so you had to assume also that generally speaking, they weren't as technologically adept maybe as someone who's younger because they didn't grow up with those technologies. And also a common thing you run into with older folks is that they might have lower vision, because that's what happens when you get old. You age and, your vision goes or your hearing goes. And that's something that, age is the leading cause of disability. So it's something that gives you a better picture, where it's telling you, okay, if we have someone who's not super familiar with these kinds of interfaces, can we present the interface in a way that's maybe more familiar to them, or can we simplify it? If it's is it necessary to have a bunch of extra buttons and panels on the side, or can we hide those away and then give them the priority lane, and then if they want the extra stuff, they can show it, giving people options for how much information they want to take in at any given time.
I think the philosophy that you're coming from is like so spot on. The piece that I like still scratch my head about is we do a lot of research ourselves within my organization, and one of the things that we look at is what's the depth of a bench at an organization when it comes to accessibility, and proportionally the number of UX researchers and academia based roles that are focused on user experience and the disciplines that you've been speaking about, the bench of people who have accessibility certifications, experience, background are have gone through the rigorous process that you've gone through is pretty few and far between. And we're talking Fortune 50, Fortune 100 brands. I know that accessibility is a very, fast growing area of focus for the organization. But I find it fascinating, right? You're investing a lot in UX research, but maybe it's not as universally design based as the term comes to be.
Yeah, no, I can agree with that. And yeah, as you pointed out, accessibility is a relatively new field, I guess, specifically as a focus and one that's growing. Obviously it's been around for a very long time. And of course we have the ADA, which has been around since like the 90s. And there's been
Right.
other laws that kind of require certain things like buildings to be accessible. But especially in the digital realm, yeah, it is few and far between. And it is something that I've noticed too, where, like you said, having these dedicated teams, often that's not the case. You actually run into a lot of people where they're kind of the one person UX team. Um,
Oh yeah.
yeah, and that's a huge challenge for them to face, and they kind of have to do everything, which, on one side, super nimble, like they get to kind of just call the shots because I am the UX team. Here's what I say, and it's what I say is what's gonna go. But also, that's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of pressure, and it's a lot of information for someone to process consistently on a daily basis. And the human brain isn't really meant to be able to do 8 things at once and think about all of them at the same time. And so that's and finding that balance of bringing in enough people as well where you can get that support, but also not putting too many cooks in the kitchen, which is also a separate problem. Where if you get into really, really big organizations that have these huge teams and it's like, look at all these designers and these people we got, but it ends up becoming basically a bureaucratic nightmare where everyone's kind of arguing over what the best decision is, and you've got 30 people in a room, and that becomes its own challenge. So it is interesting to see kind of where this is going, and also to see how much of a voice accessibility specialists are going to have in particular.
Yeah.
Because that is something I've seen as well, where sometimes they're given a huge voice because it's like, okay, well, they're the only person who knows it, so we're just going to let them decide, and that's what's going to happen. And other times it is really an uphill battle to even just get buy-in and to get people to really understand that it's important for many reasons besides the obvious moral reasons of why are we leaving people behind, but also, I mean, just for business reasons, legal reasons, et cetera, et cetera. It really makes no sense to not think about accessibility.
Talk to me a little bit about your biggest success and your biggest setback when it comes to
Yeah.
accessibility.
Let's see. I think one of my biggest successes I've had is at one point when I was working for an organization, I did an audit that it was pretty early on in my accessibility journey, but I offered to do an audit in that I reviewed kind of some of these automated uh, reports, and I decided to essentially break it down into here's what's really priority, here's what's an easy win, here's how we can approach solving these problems. And it ended up being used, and it ended up creating a lot of really easy, good wins and changes for these applications where they were able to essentially make them far more accessible with very little effort up front. And so that was really awesome because it felt great to do that and to make it easier for people to use these products, but also just to, see that it's not actually as difficult as people will think to at least make some parts of things accessible. I'm never going to say that accessibility is easy, but there are easy wins you can have if you just look in the right spots. I mean, there's always going to be those things that are more complex, and there's always going to be those challenges that are it's not as cut and dry as some other accessibility things. But when you look at it, I think the biggest thing to start on first is what's something that's going to be a really obvious pain, but also a very simple fix. Let's hit that first, because then people can at least enjoy that fix while you're working on the things that are going to take a little bit longer. And as for a setback, let me think. I'm just so great. I've never had a setback.
Yeah, no, that's kind of why I was,
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say I don't think I've ever had like a monumental like, oh, we've just fallen back 3 years or anything. But it's more like just kind of those daily conversations where kind of like where I was saying before, where I've had it where you're talking with someone and it's just kind of that trying to get buy-in, and sometimes you just don't win those conversations where you're trying to explain to someone why it's important and trying to get it prioritized. And I mean, the way I often approach those conversations, whether it be within something I'm doing, you know, for my own job, or if I'm doing it for a group I volunteer with, what have you, it, I just I usually just kind of leave it if it gets into the point where someone's just kind of, you know, not showing interest, or they're just finding reasons to you know, avoid it. But I will reapproach it at a later point, especially if I can take some time, and if I haven't already, go and gather more evidence and more things to point to say, hey, here's where a problem is going to exist because we are not addressing it, and then kind of show them what the gain is when you do address these issues. I mean, the big number that people always throw out is over $1 trillion in the disabled market for folks
Yeah.
who can't interact with some of these things. And it's, you know, it's like, okay, that number alone should be enough for a lot of businesses to be like, maybe we should consider letting people spend money at our business. But it is always an uphill battle, because it's something that, to put it, I guess the way I would put it is that humans are capable of empathy, but we're not very good at it.
Mm.
I feel like a lot of folks I've interacted with, when I bring up accessibility and I talk about it, the people who kind of immediately understand usually are people who have either had it affect them directly, as in they have a disability, or it's someone they know who has a disability.
Hmm.
And if they haven't had that interaction, it's often something that's not really anything that occurs to them, and it's not something that they really think about. And it's not to say that people are terrible people, it's just we live in our own, you know, bubbles, and we live in our own lives, and if it's not affecting us on a daily basis, we're not thinking about it all the time. And that's kind of, I think, one of the biggest challenges in accessibility is just educating people and getting people to understand the perspective of someone who is interacting with a world that's not designed for them. I mean, I actually technically have a disability in that I am colorblind. So I am it's a moderate protan. So basically, I have protanomaly. What that means is that the cones in my eyes are slightly defective. They're not completely off, but I mix up greens a lot. And I can't see them very well. And it's amazing how many things in the world are color coded. It's just something that we just assume everyone knows color. And, you know, it's something that everyone takes for granted. And I always thought I was like, I was crazy when I was growing up, because everyone just knew what a color was by looking at it. And I was like, I have to like analyze this and be like, okay, well, what's the hue of this? And is there any red in it? I don't know. And so, you know, I think that's kind of what helped me start to understand this more when I was getting older too. And I'm someone who plays a lot of video games. A lot of video games, again, use a lot of color coding, and they finally started getting better in that industry at accessibility. But it's really only been in the last maybe 5-6 years, and you know, awesome. I'm so glad they're finally getting there. But like, that's how long it took. And I was playing video games back in the 90s. Like, this is a long time, and so it's a slow journey, but I think it's moving in the right direction, albeit slowly.
It's the empathy burn.
Yeah.
So what are the biggest disruptions? I mean, you just kind of made a nice segue with the video game space disrupting it, but from your point of view, what are the biggest disruptors coming to accessibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think video games are a good disruption in that I think they are making it a lot more of a public known issue, because a lot of people either play video games or know someone who plays video games, because they're kind of a popular thing nowadays.
Mm.
And I think it is raising it into the public eye more. People are starting to see that these features exist, and they're also starting to see that accessibility features aren't necessarily always just for people who have disabilities.
100%.
It's like they can often just be great. They're really great features that help everyone. I mean, you know, Autocomplete was originally an accessibility feature. It was just to help people who had motor disabilities be able to type a little bit faster. And now everyone uses it because it's super functional and everyone loves it.
Except when they make the algorithm updates and that you're like, wait, what is this right at?
Hang on. But yeah, and so it's one of those things where, you know, I think accessibility always kind of leads the charge on a lot of these what later essentially become conveniences, or these things that are taken for granted. I mean, you know, it's the curb cut effect. It's when you introduce something that is just such a fundamentally helpful and usable design, of course everyone is going to want to use it, because it doesn't matter if you have a disability or not. It just makes your life easier. And so why wouldn't we implement it? I would say another disruption, I don't know whether it's positive or negative, I have my own opinions on it, is going to be AI. I think everyone's talking about it.
Yeah.
And oh boy, AI. It is something that I hear about all the time. I'm almost sick of hearing it.
Same.
And I think my issue with AI is that it's a lot of this AI talk really smacks of blockchain. From back in the day where everyone was like, oh my God, blockchain's going to fix the world. And then that petered out. And I think the thing that I'm worried about with AI is that it is quickly proliferating, and a lot of people are starting to use it now kind of almost on a daily basis, especially for their jobs or even their own side hustles, what have you. The problem with AI, which is the problem with computers, is that it's only as good as what you put into it. And I think a lot of fundamental misunderstandings are going on about what AI is and how it works, and what you can get out of it and what it is feasibly able to do. A lot of people that I kind of follow that are in this realm with me where they're skeptical of it is that I've played around with some of these generative AI models. I've played around with ChatGPT, what have you. They are very impressive. I think the thing that people need to keep in mind is I think they're really only good for the foundational getting the ideas. Like, I think they're great for basically spitting out really good curated information at you so that you can kind of use that to start thinking about things. But my concern is that people are going to start using these for production work. And I think it's going to be a garbage in, garbage out type situation. And I think ultimately the thing with accessibility is that accessibility is a human problem. And I think a human problem that is an area that requires a nuance and doesn't have black and white solutions needs a human solving that problem. I don't think that AI is anywhere near ready to be solving those kinds of issues. I mean, like, at that point, we could be saying that AI should be writing legislation, because that's what a lot of accessibility problems are, is figuring out how to, enforce and standardize these practices. And I wouldn't trust an AI model to do that. That seems like a very unsafe and unwise decision. I don't know. I mean, I am one person with one opinion, but I think it can, again, it'll be a great place to start. I think it's great for gathering those resources. I bet you could probably get some interesting answers just asking it, like, where should I start if I want to learn about accessibility? And it'll probably recommend some good resources. It might also not recommend some good resources, but I think it's good to use it's good for you to use to point in the right direction. I think past that, it becomes a very dangerous game of, you better know how to validate what it's giving you, because otherwise, if you just do it without checking what it's giving you, you're going to end up with probably more problems than solutions.
Yeah. Well, and to go back to the top of the conversation, do you want to miss out on the opportunity to truly know your user? Because you're not going to change that aspect. Well, Cameron, we've had an amazing conversation. I always like to close out with anything that we didn't talk about that's hot on your mind that you can have the opportunity to share and close out with if you'd like.
Oh boy, anything that's hot on my mind. I guess one thing that I'm always thinking about is just, honestly, I'm going to go back to video game accessibility. I gotta talk about it, because I think video game accessibility has been incredible. It is such a complex space in general. Making a video game is not easy. It is very complicated with a lot of moving pieces. And the fact that they are making these games accessible to folks who have motor disabilities. I mean, like, the thing with video games is that they are inherently very demanding from a motor perspective. You're using a controller, you're using a keyboard, what have you. And to see that these companies are actually putting a concerted effort into really developing and designing these solutions that make it possible for these people to interact with these things, it's really awesome. And for people who are interested, the Santa Monica Sony does great write-ups on their accessibility work and what they kind of thought about and how they approach these problems, and I really recommend reading them. They did a really great one on the 2016 or 2018, whatever, the reboot of God of War, and their work on that, and The Last of Us 2. Excellent reads. if you want to just see how someone approaches an extremely complex problem space and breaks it down into what information does someone need when they are interacting with this. I think it can be applied to anything outside of video games because it's just a really, really great example of problem solving and breaking big problems into smaller problems.
I love it. So much to take away. Thank you, Cameron. A very enlightening and exciting conversation, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks. You too.